call to my session tomorrow at 3 o'clock about how to publish in Foresight. So any of you who have an interest in that, please attend that at 3. For today, well, last month in Brussels, the IIF presented a panel discussion on AI and forecasting at the Association for Supply Chain Management's ASCM Connect conference. Excuse me. Anyway, today, Douglas Kent, who is ASCM's Executive Vice President, will be speaking on navigating uncertainty. Now, as ASCM's Executive Vice President, Douglas is responsible for executing the organization's global growth strategy and their strategic alliances. He has nearly 40 years of experience, making him an asset both to the organization as well as an in-demand speaker and a media influencer. Douglas launched his first book just a few weeks ago, Sustainable Supply Chain Orchestration, Unlearning for a Better Tomorrow. With that, Douglas.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that very much, and thank you for the very kind introduction. We're an intimate crowd, but you're so far away. So if you have a question, please try to make it as interactive as possible. I'll present some key concepts about what's happening relative to supply chain disruption and the level of uncertainty around the globe today. I think clearly you'll see the impact that this could have overall to planning. How many of you are familiar with the Association for Supply Chain Management? I see a few hands under the lights. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, we won't spend much time on this, but the reality of it is we've been active in the field of educating primarily around talent development initiatives of supply chain professionals around the globe. Now, this is pertinent to our discussion today because one of the things that really is challenging supply chain, not just from external disruption, but is our internal ability to keep pace with the amount of technology and our talent growth. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand what are the needs of supply chain professionals around the globe, and how do we work with organizations to grow their talent, but also to transform into these new, more agile, more digital business models. So transformation is a big part of that equation. Of course, we want to do that responsibly as well, so a focus on sustainability is very critical for us. And I spend a lot of time with also our foundational work, which is primarily around workforce development domestically in North America, but also relates to our global health initiatives, primarily ensuring that supply chains are working effectively and efficiently to ensure that marginalized communities around the globe have access to critical medicines, medical care, vaccines, etc. We are a signatory to the UN Global Compact, very proud of that. In fact, I'll be at the United Nations in a couple of weeks for the second time, this time speaking about human rights and fair labor wages across global supply chains. We also own the intellectual property of several reference frameworks. You may be familiar with the SCORE model. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. That's our supply chain operations reference model, but also our digital readiness model, our digital capabilities model, and of course our enterprise supply chain of sustainability standards, all of which are now made available to anyone in the world on a free of charge basis. In other words, ungated by being a member of the association. We have 50,000 members operating now in well over 100 countries. But let's get into really the meat of the discussion. And there are kind of three critical questions that people are asking at this point in time. And a lot of it is around, will we be reclaiming what used to be normal? And most people refer to this as sort of the pre-pandemic normal. But of course, so many other disruptive events have occurred beyond just that from the pandemic side. Or is there some kind of new reality which is emerging? Which of course is the case. We won't be returning back to any sense of normality, and I'll talk a little bit about what are the disruptive factors that are contributing to that. So what are those contours that are shaping what that new normal might look like? What does that new landscape hold for us? And what strategies do we really need to employ in order to prepare us for that? How do we become successful in what this new paradigm is? So let me start by first talking about the sort of imperfect storm, if you will, of some of the macro factors which are really influencing supply chain of today. Now, supply chain, of course, I guess the goodness that have come out of the situations like the pandemic is that we now have a seat at the table, or a seat at the C-suite, if you will. So people know what supply chain is. They know how it contributes not only to the bottom line, but also to the top line. Supply chain in former years were primarily the people who sat in the back and really created that incremental bottom line improvement. We weren't known as the people who created innovative new operating models that contributed to the top line. And of course, we'll talk a lot about how planning, in particular, all aspects of plan, not only the demand side, but also the supply side, is critical to basically allowing us to build these new models. But the three sort of macro factors that are occurring, of course, is ongoing inflation and recession. I know many of you probably sat in sessions, I know I did yesterday, where this factor of, it's not a predictive element anymore. When the different federal agencies are raising the cost of money in order to combat inflation, what we're not seeing is the normal reaction to that. When the cost of money increases housing, the cost of mortgages, it hasn't had the same impact that it normally had relative to the pricing of housing, for example. So there's a lot of imperfections in what we predict relative to what's happening from an inflationary and recession standpoint. And almost no country, there are a few countries that are a little bit immune to the rising prices of goods and some of the inflationary efforts. I was in the Middle East a few weeks ago, for example, and a lot of oil-producing countries have had lesser inflationary impacts. And it's not homogeneous as well. So we do see that, for example, even across an EU region, for example, different countries have different impacts relative to recession, inflation, cost of goods, et cetera. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other macro factor, of course, is the level of supply chain disruption. Now, we've had more supply chain shocks to our system than ever before in history. So it was on the demand and the supply side, but I'll talk a little bit more about our stability in supply chain in a moment. But the reality of it is that's why we can't return back to any sense of a new normality, because the lessening of these disruptions is not happening. And it's not only the volume of the disruptions which is concerning, but it's also the variety of the disruptions. And we'll talk a little bit about those types of varied disruption events. Of course, the pandemic, but we have lots of geopolitical events which are disrupting the supply chain. We have a massive problem with the flow of goods. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, how that impacts stability as well. We also have a talent shortage. And this, of course, goes back to my earlier comment that suggested that, in fact, as we introduce new technology, we can't get the return on investment of that new technology if we don't have the proper talent that is able to operate it. So it's great as we talk about these trends, which I'll get into in a moment, but if we're starting to introduce new technologies, we're starting to digitize our supply chain, we're embedding artificial intelligence into our planning and other parts of our supply chain, that's great that we can invest in the technology, but if our talent doesn't keep pace with that, then we certainly have a problem. Now, if I hit on the supply chain disruption events for a moment, it was about 18 months ago when we sat down with one of our consulting partners, KPMG, and we decided to create the world's first supply chain stability index. And the stability index looks at a variety of variables, about 30 different variables, and tries to give us a sense of where we are relative to that new norm, if you will. As you see where the bottom line is, you can see, maybe you can see here, around here, for example, this is sort of that pre-pandemic norm. We had a relatively good degree of stability within our supply chain. Not to say that we didn't have disruptions, of course we did, but again, the volume, the variety of those disruptions, not what we have seen today. Now, if we go back into the height of the pandemic, along with other situations which were happening at the same time, remember it wasn't just the pandemic that was really crippling the supply chain. There were other activities which were happening, a lot of labor shortages, a lot of strikes that were happening. We had, of course, had sickness, so workforce availability was a problem. The cost of workforce was increasing dramatically. The cost of transportation and the capacity of transportation was probably the most surprising event which was occurring. And it's a little bit scary, but it's already starting to happen again. So if I took, for example, the cost of a container shipment that was coming from China into the US, into the LA port, for example, on a pre-pandemic norm basis, the cost of a container shipment was about $1,200 US. At the height of the pandemic, that had raised to over $14,000. Even now, what we see in most recent months, a container shipment coming, for example, from China into the EU is now up and around 4,700 euros for a single 40-foot container shipment, which is about 3x the pre-pandemic norm. So this was a little bit of the surprising element when we looked at the stability, how much transportation, distribution, and warehousing were contributing to the level of instability, which is a bit surprising. Those of you who work in planning, if you're involved or engaged in a sales and operations planning process, we formerly had treated these as almost infinite capacities. We never really spent time looking at how to reshape a forecast, how to reshape a picture of demand based upon the inability to obtain transportation, or the inability to move product through a port, or the inability to have the capacity to store product in a warehouse. But in fact, this was absolutely the case. So we're still seeing that this is a major contributor. So we are in a greater degree state of stability than we were, but we still have not and don't expect to be returning to pre-pandemic norms. Now, a lot of that, of course, is what's happening around the country. At the point of the pandemic, we weren't engaged in wartime conflicts as well. This wasn't also happening, and now, of course, we have two major events coming across. We didn't have problems necessarily with having the highest degree of piracy in moving products through the Red Sea. We hadn't yet uncovered the degree of drought that was happening in shipments coming through the Panama Canal. We didn't have these unprecedented levels of cybersecurity events, which were also threatening supply chains and our data security efforts. So again, reinforcing the fact that both the volume and the variety of these supply chain events is impacting our ability to be agile. It's impacting our ability to be accurate in our planning. It's impacting our ability to satisfy customers effectively at a cost which is acceptable. Now, at ASCM, one of the things we do every year is we put together what we call the top 10 trends. And these are done through volunteer practitioners across the globe that spend their time taking a look at all of the research pieces that many of you are contributing to or involved in or have written or engaged in, and taking a look at what we believe are going to be the top 10 impacting factors that are going to influence the supply chain. I look at this as these are the top 10 factors that in fact are going to keep a supply chain professional, particularly a chief supply chain officer, this is what's going to keep them up at night, taking a look at what these impact factors are. Now, if we start to break these down, if we take a look first at the number one ranking top 10 trend, this is a digital supply chain. So when we think about the digital supply chain, it's all of these different technologies which are really integrated together. And we'll be talking about the others. So this would include things like big data and analytics. It would include things like artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, etc. But the reality of it is a digitized supply chain can mean different things to different people. What it doesn't mean is our ability to do the wrong things faster. Right? A digital supply chain is recreating a digitized operating model that's giving us a whole new sense of the importance of the interconnectivity of our technologies, and really is revolutionizing what we do and how demand forecasting fits into that equation. Of course, with the goal that this digital investment, these digital interconnected technologies will increase our ability to become more accurate in our forecasting, increasing our ability to be more agile and more responsive to different dynamics that are happening across the market. Not the least, of course, of these technologies is big data and analytics, which was #1 on the list in prior years. In fact, it was #1 on the list in the prior 3 years. So it doesn't mean that it's not important, but people are starting to get a little better of a handle on it. Now, I always joke a little bit about big data because I think in many organizations, some of which you may work in, we haven't even tackled small data yet, let alone big data, right? So this is really the aspect of being able to employ all the different data sources which are available for us and figure out the value of that data. What does it mean in terms of being able to help us increase our predictability? Enable companies not only to take data, but to action the data. This is, of course, the difference between data and information. Data is data, but information allows us to be able to take that, create insights, and allows us to drive action. So actionable insights from all this vast potential data sets that are available to us. It gives us the ability to have more precise predictions, and of course help us make much more strategic decisions. And this becomes very important. We'll talk about this in a moment because these analytic sets, it's important because sometimes the value changes depending upon what else is happening, right? So I may have placed very little value on what's happening from a weather perspective, but if I have a combined activity that suggests, for example, that I have a weather-related potential disruption, while at the same time I have piracy in the Red Sea, then the value of that weather-related data set may become more valuable to my predictive nature of forecasting. So it's really important because we just can't do that in our brain. We can't do that in a fancy pivot table. We can't do that in Excel. We can't even do that in a standard ERP system. So we have to be able to take that data in and understand its contribution and its value to predicting the supply chain and various events, both on the demand and on the supply side. Artificial intelligence, of course, is the hottest topic. It's a bit of the buzzword of today. I like to joke, I spend a lot of time at conferences, and if we were doing a drinking game every time someone mentioned AI, we would all be trashed by the end of the day, right? So artificial intelligence, of course, is important. It's not new. It's just becoming more advanced. It's becoming more of a cognitive assistance to what a supply chain professional is doing. It gives us that predictive capabilities that allow us to take some complex patterns and do something with it. One of the advantages, of course, with AI is just the speed, right? We can run different models. We can run digital twins. We can change different variables and get different outputs in a really quick fashion. We can also take in real-time data that allows us, of course, again, to improve our forecast accuracy and also to improve our inventory volatility, our inventory performance. And this is also critical. Now, of course, if we combine some of these things together, you get really what is the #4 trend here, which is we're just investing, right? We're investing in technology. We're investing in people. Not always at the same pace, as I mentioned before, and we'll talk more about, but this strategic investment in the supply chain is an easier request than it used to be. We always had, these sort of R&D funds that were for products and for technologies, but seldom did we have a research and development fund that was really focused on identifying critical technologies and talents to invest within our supply chain. And that's sort of changing. It's now allowing us to take the human expertise along with these advanced technologies and do something with it, which is critical, of course, across the end-to-end supply chain. Speaking of the end-to-end supply chain, this is something that we haven't done very well, and this is not tied to technology necessarily. I mean, of course, it's enabled by the technology, but our progression is not based upon the availability of the technology or even the cost of technology, but the supply chain is often failing in contributing what we call this sort of control tower view. So our ability to have visibility into our supply chain, to have traceability, to have location intelligence. And we'll talk a little bit more about this one because it's one of the new supply chain trends, as you can see here. It was new on the list in 2024. And one of the reasons for it is, and the reason it's become so important is because we just don't have this capability. And primarily, this is being thwarted. A progression here is being held back by our ability to trust each other. If we're going to have visibility in our end-to-end supply chain throughout the entirety of the ecosystem, what it simply means is that different players in that ecosystem have to provide necessary information for that control tower to give us that visibility, to allow us to identify in advance, proactively, potential disruptions within the supply chain. If we don't have that transparency, if we don't have that visibility, if we don't know where goods are as it's making its way through multimodal transport, then what have we achieved? The problem is if I go out and I ask even my tier 1 suppliers, let alone when I get down to tier 2, to provide this visibility, they get concerned about what I'm going to do with the data they give me. Am I going to use that against them? So when we have control tower capabilities, we've built it successfully. It means that we've built an ecosystem where we have a relatively high degree of trust, that we understand that by providing this data, it's necessary in order for us to proactively reduce the amount of potential disruption in the supply chain, to keep our promises to our customers, right? To actively inform each other when something goes wrong and not let that be discovered at the last minute when the recovery efforts become more difficult and much more expensive. Again, we'll spend a lot more time talking a little bit about visibility, traceability, location intelligence, clearly at the top of the mind as it made its list to number 5 this year. Now, there's something important around disruption and risk management. I actually heard this discussed in a couple of sessions yesterday as well. And that's really about what does risk management really mean? How do we identify potential risk events? Within our SCORE model, where we define the majority of the supply chain metrics, we call this measure VAR, or value at risk. Value at risk is taking a look at really 2 parts of the equation. One is the probability of a risk event occurring, and the second is what is the impact of that event. This is VAR. This allows us to monetize potential risks to our supply chain. Again, probability times impact. If we can monetize, then we can build or establish what we call a risk register. It helps us prioritize what are those risks that we potentially should mitigate. We can't possibly mitigate every single risk that could occur within our supply chain. If we did, it would mean bankruptcy. So we have to make clear, purposeful choices about what risks we're going to choose to mitigate. So we have to build that risk register. We have to have a risk management strategy. We have to have practices that allow us to constantly monitor and manage potential risks. We have to take a look at those probabilities. We have to take a look at the impacts. This is becoming increasingly more complex because risk events occurring singularly has one potential impact. If risk events are occurring in combination with other risk events, it could be that this inadvertently increases the amount of the impact. A good example of this, maybe I shouldn't say it being in France, but a good example of this right now could be political uncertainty and trade and tariff disruption. Independently, these would have a certain impact on an organization, a company, a country. But in combination, which is likely to occur, a combination of both having political unrest or political uncertainty in combination with also trade and tariff wars, let's say, then these 2 risk events in combination could be quite detrimental. It could increase the level of impact. So it's a complex equation when we take a look. Even though the measure VAR seems quite simple, probability times impact, the amount of risk events that could occur in combination which is more often the case if you go back to the stability index, which I mentioned earlier, where we said both the volume and the variety of those events, it's much more likely that you have multiple risk events occurring simultaneously than you ever had before as well. Now, agility and resilience becomes critically important. As we try to become more agile, it means simply that we're able to accept upside and downside changes to our demand with minimal impact. So in order to become more agile, of course, it means that we have to accept the fact that there's going to be a degree of changes. Now, those of you who are working on the demand side, of course, you recognize the fact that there can be, in some instances, doesn't matter what theory, what mathematical formula you're using for demand, sometimes there can be diminishing returns. So within supply chain, we have to look at this slightly more holistically. We have to take a look at, okay, where do I spend my money? Getting my forecast more accurate or getting my supply more agile? This is a critical question that we need to answer when we're taking a look at our supply chain strategy. Sometimes just increasing the demand forecast accuracy simply isn't enough, and maybe it's not the best use of money. What I can tell you is that a couple of things. First of all, on the resiliency and agility side, our number one response to becoming more agile is to put more inventory into our ecosystem. This is a very expensive proposition. Also can tell you that the number one contributor to not being agile is typically our supply base. It's not that we can't be agile if we're a manufacturer within our own ability to reprioritize what gets manufactured, to make changes rapidly to what our promise dates that we give our customers, etc. But unfortunately, our supply base, which is not homogeneous, doesn't have the equal level of agility. So our source agility versus like our make agility or our deliver agility or our plan agility is our source agility tends to be the one that hurts us the most. So of course this means that if we don't want to rely on the answer to agility simply to be inventory, we need to work much more closely with our suppliers. We need to have much more robust supplier relationship management in order to become more agile. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but cybersecurity is becoming an increasing concern. We, in 2023, doubled the number of cyber events that happened in 2022. And these cyber events can be quite disruptive, not only to our supply chain, but also to company valuation because of brand degradation as a result of having your brand tarnished because you allowed data to be extracted from what was meant to be secure systems. Cybersecurity events, of course, are very, very important, and they're not unrelated to some of the other activities. Just a couple of quick facts. The number one country that incurs a cyber event is the US. It's about 48% of the cyber events across the globe occur in the US. About 90% of those events, although not completely being able to document them because you have to basically track them to the source, but it's expected about 90% of those events are orchestrated by a country outside of where the event occurs. So make no mistake, most of our cyber events are politically motivated. It's a crime. It's a war crime. So cybersecurity events, of course, can have very strong brand and integrity related issues, and therefore it's often the case that if a company has suffered a cyber attack, for example, in many cases they will have lost about 20% of their brand values, 20% of their market valuation in the course of a few days after the event occurs. Things like ransomware, for example, you probably don't know this, but about when a ransomware attack happens, about 46% of those who have suffered a ransomware attack actually pay a ransom. So these could have detrimental impacts on valuations of the company. This could have detrimental impacts on supply chain security. And of course, it has impacts in terms of our ability to maintain. The other interesting thing is maintaining the data. oftentimes when these cybersecurity events happens, it oftentimes is the case that the entire ERP system has to get shut down in order to protect the balance of the data. Imagine when you shut down your ERP system, you can't take orders, you can't make shipments, you can't promise dates to customers, and you're going to have a supply chain disruption there as well. I'll talk a little bit about green and circular supply chains. Of course, this is a hot topic for me personally, but also should be for the world, is to try to build supply chains which effectively allow us to take decisions within the supply chain that are also responsible to the environment and responsible both not only green, but also from a social perspective. So having green supply chains, having circular supply chains, of course, is important relative to the future. Particularly as I sit here in France, because the #1 countries that are leading in circularity, the #1 countries that are building circular business models, who actually measure the best, who actually have the highest degree of regulation around sustainability, is Europe. Nordic is a good example of that, Netherlands and Germany. The top 5 countries in the world primarily that support sustainable supply chains are in this region. I could add Japan from Asia into that list as well. As I'm coming from North America, some others are, I would say, sadly, we're following the others relative to the advancement on circular supply chains. Circular supply chains are also critically important because this is where supply chain and design chain actually meet. So this is the intersection. I build circularity by first introducing sustainability concepts, reuse capabilities, repurposing capabilities, sadly, and lastly, recycling capabilities in the design of my product, which is then respected and managed throughout the supply chain. But I can't do circular supply chains, building circular business models, without having that critical intersection with my design community. And this is sometimes difficult because it's not always easy for supply chain to talk to engineers, right? It's like that's a difficult discussion. These are still, in many instances, very isolated silos from a functional standpoint, but very important for us to build those capabilities together. Lastly, and not, of course, none of these are not related to the others, but is the geopolitical nature of what's happening and the deep globalization of supply chains. I think I will, when we're all together next year, I think we're in Beijing, I'm going to guess this one that is new on the list is going to raise in its elevation in terms of the level of importance. There are so many deglobalization factors which are happening that are geopolitical in nature. As you see here in Europe, for example, and what could be the case also for the US, but also in other regions, there's a couple of things happening. So there's a lot of nationalization that's happening in the political world, which means we're trying to deglobalize the overall supply chain, becoming more country independent, rather than have the level of dependency that we have on other countries, the import-export, for example. So that's going to escalate the amount of trade and tariff wars that are occurring. In the US, if we have a return to administration by Mr. Trump, he's already said, for example, he's making very blanket statements to say anything that's imported into the US once he becomes president will have a tariff increase of 10%. Just imagine what that does to a global supply chain. Just imagine the reciprocal reaction that different countries will have. This was already occurring in prior administration. And that certainly could occur. Also, there were elections here in France on Sunday, for example, which would indicate a movement to the far right might also become a much more nationalistic strategy and therefore have impacts on globalization. Perhaps the biggest example, however, is what is commonly known as the China +1 strategy. So there has been a major movement over the course of the last 18 and 24 months to de-risk the dependency on China. Not just China, also the case with semiconductor chips in Taiwan. But in China's China +1 strategy means I'm going to reduce my dependency on China as being the global manufacturer to the world, and I'm going to look for alternative sources that perhaps de-risk that. One of the primary drivers of that, of course, is the fear factor that there will be a disruptive event from a geopolitical standpoint that gets actuated by China with any sort of semblance of Putin having success in terms of its war on the Ukraine. That could mean a stronger stance from China relative to Hong Kong, relative to Taiwan, which would also be very disruptive to the overall supply chain. So you're actually seeing nearshoring, reshoring, different choices relative to my supply chain network as a response to the China Plus One strategy. So that means that manufacturing that's being done in China is being moved to other places. The biggest collective recipient of that are other Southeast Asia countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, for example. As a singular country, India and Mexico are the leaders in terms of receiving manufacturing movements from China to their regions. India, of course, primarily to support demand in Europe. They have a very strong, well, they're now the largest populous country. They have a growing educated workforce, relatively inexpensive labor, becoming a good alternative. Mexico, of course, also the same, primarily for US domestic demand. The cost of wages for a typical manufacturing worker between Mexico and the US are quite dramatic. In fact, it is believed that the differential in the cost of labor, for example, in Mexico versus the US is the highest disparity of any two bordering nations in the world. Now, we don't just imagine this to be the case. Nearshoring has always been one of those things that we're suspect of. If some kind of disruption happens, will we see nearshoring occur? And of course, it has occurred. And we saw this very clearly in the last release of our stability index. For the first time in 20 years, just taking you back in history, some of you are a little younger than me. When you go back in history, about 20 years ago, the US decided to chase low labor cost, and they moved the manufacturing, most of their manufacturing, a huge amount of their manufacturing, to China in order to gain that low labor cost. As a result of that, of course, we increased the amount of imports. That means we increased the amount of goods that were coming in from China. For the first time in 20 years, in the first quarter of this year, we had more goods coming over the border through Laredo, Mexico, coming from Mexico into the US than we had coming from China through the ports. For the first time, the volume of goods was higher, in the first time in 20 years. That indicates, of course, that the nearshoring efforts is not a hypothetical occurrence. We see massive growth, particularly in the northern states of Mexico, around Monterrey as an example, where there's massive investment in infrastructure there to increase the ability to create manufacturing. So I wanted to bring these trends forward really for you to understand what we need to be thinking about, because there's a lot of things that we can do within the supply chain, but there are a lot of things that are hitting us at the same time. We have the goodness is we have an elevation of our profession. We have the respect of the board of directors. We have the respect of the C-suite as being professionals that can actually create new business models that are taking advantage of these new technologies, that really can create new operating models that increase top-line performance, that can make the difference between a loser and a winner relative to our supply chain, as our supply chain often competes. Of course, for us, it always comes back to the need to keep pace. So the common theme that I'm leaving you with today as we take a look at all of those factors is the fact that with all of these varied investments, with building out a whole new architecture, with reinventing what an operating model could look like, looking at what the importance of your role is in that operating model, we need to remember that the talent needs to keep pace with that. So we have to keep the pace in the investment on our systems and our people. We got to make sure that workers can adjust, and we give them time to adjust on how to work with new technologies, how to adopt new practices. We need to make sure that we identify what are the future skill capabilities that are required. You know, if you go back a couple of years, you could barely find a data scientist no matter what amount of money that you wanted to pay, right? And there are going to be these critical skills and competencies, the ability to create new network designs, ability to run effective digital capabilities models, the ability for us to basically take advantage of these new technologies becomes super important. Sadly, I don't think it's working as well as it should. I think particularly in times, if I go back to the macro factors that I mentioned earlier, it oftentimes is the case that at times when we have inflationary pressures, when we're concerned about recession, when there are geopolitical tensions, when there are new elections which are going on, we pull back our spend, and one of the areas we pull back our spend on is the investment in talent, which is a massive mistake. Again, it becomes very important as we take a look at this combination of technology and talent, as we take a look at the three areas that I mentioned earlier, which is our overriding lack of visibility, transparency, and traceability. Again, this is very, very critical for the efficient and effective new supply chain. Our ability to have visibility, have the data and the information, to weight that data, understand the importance of gaining that data in a real-time fashion, getting those supply chain partners to share that data with us, to be able to create that infrastructure that I referred to earlier as the control tower. And this goes beyond Tier 1. Now, there is some hope. There's probably more hope here in Europe than there is in the US, because we oftentimes don't even understand our Tier 2 supply base, let alone the Tier 3. The thing that's accelerating that for Europe, of course, is the regulation on what we call Scope 3 emissions reporting, which means that I have to understand who my Tier 3 supply base is because I have to report their emissions. And that becomes a regulatory requirement. So we're gaining that visibility of our Tier 2 and our Tier 3 supply base as a result of that. On the transparency side, of course, it's a very important. Data integrity is super important, having accuracy in our data, reliability of that information. There is that ongoing trust issue. We see that particularly in supplier reluctance to be able to provide us that information. But again, I think it's going to be accelerated a bit by compliance and regulation. Our supply base, as it remains still today, quite globally dispersed. We have some other barriers relative to culture, language, cost, and resources. On the traceability side, some industries do better than others relative to industry to be able to trace the origins of materials. But again, this becomes important as it relates to things like counterfeit goods, as it relates to, we have this growing problem in certain industries where the origin is questionable. I was in Mumbai 2 weeks ago meeting with pharma companies, and they told me that the the drugs that are being brought into the US, that are being bought by sources outside of the US that you can order online, if you will, these so-called generic drugs, that 30% of the drugs that arrive at the patient's home, I'll loosely call them a patient, depends on what you're ordering, I guess, but the patient's drugs, about 30% actually are not the drug that was ordered. It was a counterfeit replica of some sort of that good, which is super, super concerning. This is also very important, as I mentioned earlier, relative to global health, making sure that the amount of theft that occurs in the last mile delivery of critical medicines doesn't also make us question whether or not a patient is receiving the drug that they want or the drug that they need. So this becomes very important. Of course, the complexity of our supply chain, the dispersion of that information is also a massive contributing factor. So when we take a look at what does this mean overall, we have our SCORE model standard. So many of you are familiar with the SCORE model, Supply Chain Operations Reference Model. Again, this is a digital standard. It's a massive amount of data that cuts across processes, all the processes in the supply chain down to level 3. You're looking at the level 1 version of this. That information, along with its corresponding metrics, the critical KPIs that you might want to reference. The SCORE model is the definitive standard for defining that, as well as best practices and people skills and competencies. Always exist in the SCORE model, available free for download. Some of the renovations that we made to the model is to reinforce the importance of planning. What I would tell you is, having worked with the model was first initiated in 1996, released in 1997. I worked on the version 1 of the model. I'm still working with the model now, and this is version 14, some decades later. On this new version, of course, what we see is an entrance in our orchestrate, which used to be called the enabling functions. These orchestration functions, we see enterprise business planning, or IBP. finding its way there as a critical orchestration factor, making sure that our various levels and types of plans are integrated together on an enterprise level, and that we don't have differences between what we're trying to achieve strategically, financially, or operationally. That becomes very, very important. But out of all of these processes, plan, source, order, fulfill, transform, return, plan still today remains the least mature of all of our processes. In other words, we're much better at executing across our supply chain than we are at planning for that execution. We still are better firefighters than we are doing fire prevention. So it becomes critically important that we spend a lot of time looking at how we can effectively leverage best practices, leverage technology, entice talent into working better, particularly around the plan function and, of course, the larger integrated or enterprise business planning. To that note, what we have done is take our SCORE model, and we've built a maturity assessment around that model to allow you also to be able to assess your maturity levels across your supply chain. And you need to look at this end to end. None of those processes, and the reason that you see that in sort of that circular type of diagram is the fact that it becomes important that we make the investments equally across the supply chain. It might be great that I have, IoT integrated into my manufacturing floor, but if I can't plan well, then maybe the use of that technology is not going to return the investment that we expected. It's great that I have advanced analytics in one place, but I don't have it in another. It's great that I have artificial intelligence, but it's isolated in customer service and not being used somewhere else. So it becomes super important that we have end-to-end supply chain maturity. So we built a maturity assessment that takes a look at about 23 different factors across the supply chain. It's heavily focused on orchestrate and planning to take a look at where you are. Where are you on this supply chain maturity progression? And that goes from the left-hand side, level 1, very reactive supply chain, to the right-hand side, level 5, orchestrated supply chain. This is a distributed survey. This is what we provide to any organization across the world, again, like the model, free of charge. So if you want to understand where you are, where your weaknesses, where your opportunities are, where your strengths might actually lie across the end-to-end supply chain, I'd encourage you to take advantage of this assessment. And this is where you would fill out a form to complete this assessment. And again, what it really requires is for you to take a look at your maturity levels across the variables, and then you can actually take the assessment for free. We then create a customized, tailored report for your organization and give you a sense of, again, where your strengths might be, but more importantly, where your opportunities lie. So I know that's a lot to digest in a little less than an hour. We wanted to give some time for some questions. So we can do that now and hopefully get some of your queries answered. Thank you. I think there's, of course, you're going to get your steps in, Michael. It's all the way in the back, right? So we not only have dispersed data, we have a dispersed audience as well. So.
Hi, thank you very much for the good presentation. I have one question in the beginning. You said the problem of data sharing is trust, in the sense that if you want to request the data, they won't give it to you because they don't trust what you do with the data. Do you think that the idea is like federated learning, where you use encrypted data sharing, or where you don't actually share the data, but intermediate informations could provide a solution, or do they have, in a sense, the same problem that you would to convince the people of actually trusting these privacy-preserving frameworks?
Yeah, I think, so I definitely think that's one part of the answer. I think there are kind of three components to that trust. One is creating some degree of anonymity to the information, as you might say, using an encrypted format. The other is to ensure that your systems are protected and these advancing cybersecurity issues are not likely to happen, so that that information could be shared outside because you're sharing it with a third party that you're entrusting with the information. And the third, I think, is more cultural and perhaps the most difficult. And that is the fact to actually take the time to explain what you're doing with the information. Why is this information important? What decision is this enabling? So it doesn't just seem like an ad hoc request, but the reality of it is you're trying to do something to make the combination of that relationship, whether that's supplier to you or you to a customer, trying to make that more effective. I think we rushed very quickly to say, give me, give me, give me, and we didn't spend the time to explain why we need it and what we're doing with it. So I think all three of those are critically important. The first two, I would say, or at least the first one to your earlier point about using encryption techniques and federated data, et cetera, I think, again, that can be demonstrated through the technology. That doesn't overcome the cultural issues. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So I was curious about the top trends list. I noticed that there were, I think, 4 of them that were new as of 2024, which made me curious of what fell off the top 10 list. What became less important?
Good question. So some of them got actually combined together into new themes. So some of that is as a result of that. What fell down on the list? Trying to think what fell off of. They didn't fall off the list, they probably fell down on the list. The report does publish the top 20. As I reflect on the top 20, nothing left the list. It might either got redefined or got shoved down. That full report is available on the ascm.org website, and you can see that. I would encourage you to download the report because it also talks a little bit more detail than I was able to today about the importance of the trends, but you'll see the full list that are there. I know some of them, things like the importance of a retail supply chain, is on the 11 to 20 list as opposed to the top 10. That was the only industry-specific one that actually appeared on the list in the top 20, because there's a great deal of concern about what is the future of retail. We've seen so much advancement in the e-commerce world, and there was not a rebound to brick and mortar that we had expected post-pandemic wise. So there's a massive, I work a lot with the National Retail Federation, the Return Logistics Association, some of the other nonprofits in the space. And this is, these new rapidly changing, ever evolving business models are critically important. Almost no one who's surviving is not omni-channel today, et cetera. But the full list is available in the report. Again, some of it got reshaped. I know the circular versus green supply chain kind of got combined together because it became important that we consider those things in combination. Yeah, so I think the full report, you'll be able to see the differences there. Hi.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious, you mentioned that planning organizations are often sort of less mature than other parts of the supply chain. You also mentioned that orchestration is, the level of orchestration really dictates maturity up to a certain point. I'm curious, what I've noticed is that planning teams will very often look at a beautiful orchestrated set of systems around them and then go to spreadsheets and do everything manually and upload it.
Really? You noticed that too?
Yeah. I'm curious if you've seen any trends in the organizations that are able to leapfrog past that obstacle, like what works for organizations?
Yeah, I mean, this has been sort of a bit of a progression, I would say. So initially, there was this recognition that single ERP systems, I'm not going to talk names, SAP, Oracle, traditional ERP systems weren't effective to manage the dynamics of planning at large. So then we started to build all these separate modules, right? We had what we call, generically speaking, advanced planning systems, right? These were typically bolt-ons to ERP that were meant to be more advanced that could handle the dynamics. It was a disaster. I mean, the reality of it is that everything that you just mentioned is exactly what occurred. Unfortunately, we couldn't connect the dots. We were so used to having Excel formulations and pivot tables where we can say, oh, this happened and I can see this output. I can connect the dots. And suddenly I had to trust these algorithms I didn't even understand. So that has certainly happened. And I think that's why we're starting to see even more investment in the planning side. I don't mean to suggest that planning as a profession is less mature than others. I just think organizationally it's so complex and it drives all the execution activities that the importance of it is consistently raised. And I think that's important because I think our targeted destination for high levels of maturity in planning are so much more greater and so much more difficult to reach than some of the execution functions. And now with the use of all of the new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence capabilities, super important, but also just the impact of our amount of external data that has to be considered, that has to be evaluated relative to its importance and its contribution to accuracy is making it much more complex. It's a more difficult, I mean, I worked in planning too, so it's just a more difficult ladder to climb overall.
Hi, just continuing on the same question about planning, right? So your assessment is planning is less mature, the least mature.
Not mine. It's the collective people who have done maturity that have said themselves, just to be clear. But yes.
Yeah, right. But that's based on your assessment of multiple companies, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So
Over about a decade.
Over a decade, right? So what are some of the factors contributing to it, right?
So I think if you take a look at this progression in terms of what this actually means, and you move from very reactive, slightly efficient and reactive, but then very integrated, extended, it's this path between 3 and 4 that becomes the most difficult leap for most planning organizations. That means I'm not only going to take my internal data, my typical information that I would use myself, but I'm actually going to integrate my information directly with my customers and my suppliers. I'm going to actively gain real-time data on demand changes. I may just think about, I'm going to take actual POS from retail stores into my supply chain, right? I'm going to see the flow of the manufacturing and my product's prioritization on my supplier's manufacturing floor. That's what I need to get to move to a tier 4. That's damn difficult to do, right? So when I can become very efficient and effective in utilizing internal information, and I'm still going to be at a level 3. When I start to integrate that and include customer and supplier information, real-time, I use the term loosely, right? Like not every 5 seconds, but when I can start to integrate information from my trading partners, customer and supply side, then I'm going to start to reach a level 4. And there are organizations who are doing level 4 and level 5, for sure. I'd say if you take a look at some of the CPG companies, some of the fast-moving consumer goods, these are organizations which are very effective on integrating and even orchestrating their supply chain throughout their planning cycles. There's a lot of data sharing that goes on in that sector. Has to be. Remember that I have to do a better job to do effective planning if I don't want my answer to agility to be inventory. And these companies don't have the margin capabilities to do that. They have to invest in the supply chain to build out the maturity levels of the plan side.
Yeah, Douglas, you had a really interesting note on upskilling not working very well with talent and new technology. I'm curious if you have heard of examples where it has worked well and what has enabled that.
Yeah, so we have organizations that we work with that have enterprise-wide talent development planning that we assist with them on. So they go through, we have a whole talent assessment as well that is available to corporations. And that talent assessment allows them to understand what are critical capabilities they need today to effectively and efficiently manage the supply chain, but more importantly, to identify talent that they're going to need in the future and making sure that they have both hiring plans and development plans for their talent to do that. I won't name names specifically of organizations, but there are several examples of organizations that You know, they have hundreds and hundreds of people that go through our certifications and et cetera. What becomes effective with that is you make it mandated, right? Organizations, you know, if I want to move from this position to this position, I have to go get this certification. Now, there's a lot that has been done. If you take a look at our website as well, a career and salary survey, that would suggest that credentials, so certifications and the like, so non-degreed certifications elevate your professional life dramatically, both in terms of the pay that you make, the progression in your career, et cetera. So I think that's a big part of that. Other organizations, we spend a lot of time on measuring the return on education. So there's two sides of it. When I go get these types of educations through, and I take advantage of a talent plan that my company did for me, I'm going to gain all of these great things for me as an individual. But the company needs to know that their investments are also getting a payback. So building this concept of understanding return on education is also important to that equation.
Perfect. Thank you.
Coffee break time. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you.